Okay, so we're going to start talking about populations, what affects the size of a population. This is pretty darn obvious. So, the size of a population depends on biotic and abiotic factors. It basically depends on everything. For example, biotic factors would be the number of prey animals, the food that's available, the resources that are available, living space. The abiotic factors that limit the producers that the animals you eat depend on. For example, sunlight, water, temperature, nutritional value, the minerals in the soil. And then interactions affect the population size as well. The presence of predators on you, parasites, disease, competition for the food, space, and mates. These are all factors that influence a population size. So how can a population grow? Well, birth. The birth rate can increase. More babies are born. Or you got immigration of individuals of the same species moving in. How can populations decrease? Death rate increases, organisms die in the population, or they immigrate. Immigrate means move out. Again, this is repetitive, but the abiotic features, the availability of food, water, shelter, and place to live, raise a family. Those will limit population growth if not available, if not enough of it's available for the population. And then community interactions, those are biotic features, like I already said, predator-prey, competition, and symbiosis, particularly parasitism. So a population will start out with exponential growth, which means that the rate of the population keeps on increasing with time. The growth of the population keeps on increasing with time. Okay, so the y-axis is the number of individuals in the population. So you start out with a small population, and then the x-axis is the time passing. The first graph I have on the left side shows linear growth. What does that mean? That's not exponential growth. It means the population's increasing at a steady rate. You know what slope is? It's the steepness of a curve. So the steeper the curve, the faster the population's increasing. But if the line's straight, the curved line is straight, that means it's changing, it's increasing at a constant rate. Now, exponential means that the curve's getting steeper and steeper and steeper with time. The the growth of the population is increasing at an increasing rate. So you take a chunk of time right here and compare it to a chunk of time right here. Same chunk of time. You've added that many more individuals as opposed to that many. So you're not just increasing by a constant rate, you're increasing by a greater rate as time goes on. Now this only happens, this exponential growth only happens if there's unlimited resources and all the waste products don't start building up and causing sickness. There's no parasites, there's no predators. So it's kind of an ideal situation. It's like what bacteria do when they're put on a culture plate in the laboratory, or when they find a nice food source with no competition around. So as the food source diminishes, as the population increases, the available food becomes more scarce, the population will decrease. Individuals will starve or move away to a better, they might migrate to a warmer climate, or they just don't have babies. Obviously, when resources are in abundance, population size will increase. You can feed more people, you can have babies, not worry about your babies not having enough food. But when resources are not available, food mainly, population size will obviously decrease. Okay, so when individuals go to a place where there's no competition, unlimited resources for their numbers, they will have exponential population growth. So here we see the exponential population curve, but then it straightens out. Okay, it straightens out. Population is still increasing. Parents are still having babies, but not everyone's able to have children. So, and then eventually, the food resources, the kids won't be able to have as many children as their parents because there's limited food resources, and so it might overshoot, like it did right here, overshoot what we call the carrying capacity. The carrying capacity is the maximum number of individuals a population can have in a certain area based on the limiting factors like how much food there is, how much water there is, how much predation there is, how much disease there is, parasites, how many competitors from another species there are. So here we go again with some limiting factors. Here's some biotic ones. How fertile the soil is. If plants aren't going to grow there, you're not going to get the phosphate and nitrogen you need as an animal to live a healthy life and be able to leave children. Water, like I said, water is limiting. Again, if there's not enough water, you're not going to have enough producers to provide food, and you're you as an organism need water to replenish the cytosol in your cells and your blood. So other biotic limiting factors would be parasites, like bacteria or anything that causes a disease, virus even. And yet another biotic limiting factor is predation, of course, and competition from other species. It doesn't have to be predation where it kills you. It could be competition for food or water from other species. So that'd be interspecific competition for food, water. Okay, so you can imagine what prevents you from thriving, and those are limiting factors. And that limits the population growth. It makes the population curve less steep and might make it go down. Okay, so this looks like fairly stable population. Now, if you zoom out of it, so here's the y-axis is like, let's say, hundreds of individuals in a given population. So this would be like 0.200, which would be 20 individuals. Okay, so it's already grown to be about 1 times 100, so about 110 individuals. That's the carrying capacity. Now, the population is neither growing or declining. So what does that mean? That means the birth rate plus the number of individuals moving into the area in that same species equals the rate that individuals are dying plus the rate that they're immigrating. And it stays kind of constant. But the population is at the carrying capacity of its habitat. Now, sometimes you have a stable population. What happens is some new species comes in, is introduced to your habitat, and they are a better competitor. They have adaptations that allow them to outcompete you or something in your habitat that is destructive to the health of the habitat or ecosystem, because it reduces the diversity of the ecosystem. Things die as they get outcompeted. Their population decreases. Now, these species that do that are called invasive species. They might come and they come in and they don't have a predator. They don't have a parasite. Whereas the ones that live there before the invasion have their predation. They have limiting factors that keep their populations down. There's nothing to keep these invasive species down yet. So, example would be the kudzu vine, and in Georgia, you can see it all over the place. Like, here's a winter where the leaves die on it, but then look what happens as we go to spring. It starts growing, and pretty soon it's covering everything. the cabin's totally this covered. The trees are covered, and that hurts the trees because they can't make photosynthesis. They can't make their own food easily because they're covered with the vine leaves. And the vine leaves are getting the sun, not the leaves of the trees. And even the ground cover is covered with that. So if the producers are declining, the herbivores that eat those producers might not want to eat the invasive species. And what happens is, as the producers go, the things that the higher trophic levels that depend on the herbivores aren't going to get fed, and so basically this hurts a stable ecosystem. You can see this guy in the kudzu and how thick it is right there. How thick it is. Now, we can eat it. It's not toxic, but animals that live on the ground, I mean, it's not like grass. The leaves are kind of tough as well. Some ecosystems are resilient in the sense that they can bounce back from disturbances over a relatively short period of time. So like a forest fire, sometimes the trees in the forest are adapted to the forest fire. In fact, their seeds won't grow unless they are exposed to a fire. And that keeps an ecosystem, the forest ecosystem, from going extinct in that region. So rangers will actually, in parks, they'll do what are called controlled burns in sections of the park every year. And they'll actually have a fire go through a controlled fire, go through a section, burning the trees and all the vegetation, and then you'll see weeks later the new little trees growing out of the blackened ashes. It's pretty cool. But they plan that because some ecosystems require fire to bring new trees in and keep the ecosystem healthy. So water pollution is kind of a new thing that ecosystems really aren't used to, so they can't be resilient to that. So water pollution can decrease the biodiversity by killing plants and animals, and especially the invertebrates that live there that eat the algae that the fish, the baby fish, depend on feeding on. So if the invertebrates, like the water insects, die, then the baby fish don't have food. Also, in this case, this is not a baby fish. This fish was just poisoned by the chemicals that were added to the water. Or the chemicals that added to the water took away the oxygen that was in the water, and the fish died from that. So here's part of a food web up north, I guess, Northern California, Alaska. So you can read this. This ecosystem is imbalanced. Carnivores feed on salmon, okay, like bears, and then they carry, when they poop in the forest, they give the nutrients from the salmon into the soil, and the berries and plants depend on it. The trees depend on it. So that helps the bear get his other vitamins from plants. Okay, so I should put it like this. So everything goes to the decomposers eventually in their poop or when they die, and then those nutrients are returned to the soil. And it's the plants on the riverbed that shade the shoreline, and that's where the baby trout can grow. That's their habitat. Take away the trees, that would disrupt the whole thing with trout. And if there's no baby trout, there's not going to be salmon there. If there's no salmon, there's not going to be bears. There's not going to be berries and plants because there won't be, the soil won't be rich with nutrients. Okay, so take away one of these things and it disrupts the ecosystem. It unbalances it. Okay, so here's a scenario where I don't know how the decomposers can go away, but that's what they picked. Okay, so you disturb one thing in ecosystem because it's a complicated web. Remember our food webs, those pictures we looked at that show all the different interactions between the animals and plants in an ecosystem. You take away one big thing, one piece of that web, and the ecosystem's going to be disturbed. It will affect the whole ecosystem, much like the domino effect. So you cut too many trees down in a forest, you overhunt, you overfish, you add pollution, all this will take out key elements of the ecosystem and unbalance it and disturb it, making it less biodiverse and less resistant to environmental change. So, you know how annoying alligators can be if you live near the water. They show up on golf courses in your yard. And they also they annoy fishermen because they eat the kind of fish that they like to catch. Sports fishing, game fishing is called. So it used to be that you could just kill the alligators with any amount of alligators you wanted to. And then the alligator population became very small and endangered. It became an endangered species. But the weird thing is, as alligators disappeared, the game fish, the kind that the fishermen thought were being eaten by the alligators, started decreasing. Their population started declining. So how did that happen? Well, alligators, it turns out, actually prefer the gar, this fish right here, which isn't a game fish at all. So these gars actually are predators of game fish. The juveniles, not the big adults, but the juveniles of game fish. And so when this prey, major prey of the alligator, was released from the limiting factor of predation of the alligator, that what happened was there was an overpopulation of these guys, and they fed on much more than they did before because there was fewer numbers on the game fish children. And so there weren't any game fish to replace the ones that got caught by fishermen, or there were much fewer. So, so the alligator was then put on the endangered species list and protected from hunting for that reason. And then the gar population went back down, and the sports fishing industry became happy again because that population of game fish increased because of the decrease in the population of the gar. Here's another example of disturbing a food web. Okay, sea otters, the kind that live in the ocean, they hide. They live in these giant seaweed forests called kelp. And kelp protects them and other baby fish, many species of baby fish, from predation. I guess sharks would be the predators, and it's harder for them to find the otters when they're in that kelp. Now, fishermen thought that the sea otters were eating their fish, so they kind of killed them because they didn't want that competition. Also, they were hunted for their fur. Otter fur is soft, and they were almost hunted to extinction for those two reasons. You can read this. This is what I just told you. Now, the sea otter is considered a keystone species in the sense that if you take it out, there's a huge domino effect on the ecosystem. If we look at the next slide, where do they get the name keystone? Well, the keystone is that piece in a wall when they used to make arches. If you took that out, the whole wall would collapse. These would fall, and the whole wall up there would fall. So that's why it's called the keystone, or the cornerstone is similar to that. So you take out the otter, and the whole ecosystem falls apart. When I say the ecosystem crashes, we call that a trophic cascade. Think of cascade as like a waterfall. And the trophic levels, each trophic level is affected and sees a decline. So the otter ate a bunch of different things. He was omnivore. And so usually those are the kind of things that are keystone species. In South America, Central America, the jaguar, who lives in a rainforest, eats about 87 different types of prey. So he's the keystone species. It's the keystone species because it keeps those populations down. Remove the jaguar, and one of those populations is gonna grow and damage the food web, and maybe crash the whole ecosystem, change it into a less diverse community. Okay, Here's another example of a keystone species where reefs grow, coral reefs grow. The parrotfish, it's kind of a big fish. He actually cleans parasites off the reef, the coral reef. And so it keeps the coral reef open to the sunlight, and the little critters that live in the coral, the invertebrates that are the coral organisms, can filter feed better than the parrotfish would be considered. Therefore, the keystone species, because you take him away, the corals would eventually become very unhealthy, and coral reefs are very rich in diversity. And if they died, then the biodiversity would, the whole ecosystem would crash. Okay, so shark is a keystone species of the Atlantic Ocean. It's also a top predator in the sense that he eats the big fish, like tuna. So once again, fishermen figured, well, let's kill the shark so we got more tuna to catch. And so the tuna eats smaller fish and another sport fish, mackerel. And so when the tuna population, when you took the shark out, the tuna population increased, and the smaller sport fishes, their populations decreased because they were the prey for the tuna. And then there became an overabundance because the small fish that eat the zooplankton are animal like protists or invertebrates. You decrease these populations, the zooplankton would go up. And if the zooplankton would go up in population, the phytoplankton would go down because it would have, that's what zooplankton eats. So this is the bottom of the energy pyramid, right? So if you chip away at the bottom, the base of the ecosystem, if you take away, if the phytoplankton decrease in numbers, you're not going to have enough energy to feed the primary consumers, which would be these zooplankton. And that would crash, and then everything crashes because the small fish that won't have as many zooplankton to eat. So the tuna would eventually, therefore, up the food chain. Where the tuna was, there wouldn't be enough food for the tuna, so the tuna population, which increased at first, would fall. And so it was understood that you need shark to keep the tuna population down and keep the ecosystem in balance. Again, the trophic cascade is when all the dominoes fall. That's when all the trophic levels decline because you took the keystone species out, or you took some other element of the ecosystem out of there, something that a higher trophic level depends on. We humans are very prone to causing disturbances to ecosystems, overhunting, overfishing. These are examples. deforestation. You're taking the habitat away from ecosystems, so they crash. Farming that is unsustainable in the sense that we grow crops that really drain the nutrients out of the soil, and then we put artificial fertilizer on the field. This kind of destroys the bacteria that are the nitrification bacteria, and it just ruins the soil. You have to wait a long time till that soil goes back to what it was. That's unsustainable farming. Industrialization, of course, that takes up the land that was part of a natural ecosystem. The factories, the streets, the roads, the trucks, the chemicals that the industrial place needs, the heat that it produces, the electricity that it takes to make stuff that probably is that people think they need. So cities and suburbs, again, that's more concrete. That's more habitat taken from other animals and plants and decomposers. Of course, burning of fossil fuels that cause air pollution and global warming. When you mine land, you strip the surface, usually. And of course, that's totally obliterating ecosystem that was there. Water and air pollution, I already mentioned. Introducing invasive species by accident to new environments that diminish the biodiversity of the original habitats. So some ecosystems, if the disturbance is small, infrequent, they're resilient. They'll bounce back. But if humans take advantage of the ecosystem, overfish, or use technology that takes too many fish out, that ecosystem is not going to survive. And it will actually destroy it. It'll become a sterile lake, a dead lake. And this is true about any ecosystem. Yeah, the ecosystems can come back by succession over a long period of time, but that takes centuries. Again, ecosystem is more resilient. It can bounce back from disruptions easier the more biodiverse it is, the more web strands it has. Because if you take out one thing and something else can take the place of it to a certain extent. But if you're a small ecosystem, a very low biodiverse ecosystem, you take one thing out and the whole system hurts. So if you take out the clam here, the other things can eat. Most of the other things can eat other things so that it won't make a really huge, as big an impact. But if you take it out of a system that doesn't have all kinds of biodiversity, then the whole system will crash. Okay, so here's a human population curve, and it's rather exponential right now. For the last 2,000 years, it looks like it's been rising exponentially. It can't do this. The Earth has a carrying capacity, and it has to level off at some point, or else there'll be a um, massive drop, crash in the human population. Wars and disease seem to have a leveling effect to this, but really, no, it just keeps on going because um, people keep on having babies, etc. Now, certain countries have a lower birth rate than other countries, but when you take all the countries together, it's exponential growth. So we think there's questions about this. We think it's starting to level off around now. Some people think it's leveling off around now. Some people think you can go further before, we'll start seeing crashes or declines. There won't be enough food. There won't be enough space. There's always enough space, but, good space? That's the question. Will there be a space where you can make your own food, grow your own crops? No. And some people think it will keep on going into, the next century, because technology will always find a way to provide more food, more living space. Because we have a brain, we can figure things out, we can build things to provide for people, more people, and okay, so it's kind of up in the air, but probably the biggest threat to the biosphere is our interference. And if you take AP Environmental Science, you'll find out that human population exponential growth is the biggest threat to the biosphere. Now, we can change our attitudes as to the biosphere and switch this around, but a lot of people think the world is just a place to take advantage of. Who cares about the animals that live there? Or I just want my nice little paradise and get those other wild things out. And it's that kind of attitude that's going to destroy the biosphere. Okay, so here they talk about how our brain and our technology can extend the carrying capacity, but there's a limit to that. Okay, so I want to go through a few classic examples of human interference that has really historically hurt some important ecosystems. So mercury is a heavy metal that is toxic to living things. It ruins your nervous system eventually. And mercury is sometimes emitted in small quantities in coal. And when you burn the coal, mercury comes off and then precipitates into the water. Volcanoes give it off, amongst other nasty, harmful chemicals. Mines, when you have a mine and you're washing your material that you're getting, it comes out of the ore and it runs off into the water. So the little tiny invertebrates, zooplankton and shrimp, will absorb that that mercury that is in the water, and it doesn't kill them. I mean, they only have a short life anyway. And then oyster filter feeders will eat a lot of those zooplankton, but mercury concentrates in the tissues of whatever ingests it. So the oysters, especially, will, because they filter feed, they'll eat so many zooplankton with a little tiny bit of mercury. That mercury builds up in the oyster. But unless there's a lot of mercury that was added in that water, oysters are okay for us to eat. And, other fish will eat the krill as well, and zooplankton, especially as babies. Now, tuna will eat the salmon and pollock fish, especially when they're babies. And by then, the mercury will trouts live longer than oysters, and so that mercury will build up in the tissues of the trout, especially in tuna, especially the older they get. So this is called bioaccumulation or biomagnification, where a toxic element builds up in the tissues of whoever's eating it. So you're not really supposed to eat tuna more than twice a week, or else you'll accumulate the mercury in your tissues, and it can lead to nervous system issues. And shark and pike, these are bigger fish. So they eat a lot of tuna. So a lot more mercury gets concentrated in their body because the fish they eat has accumulated already, and they'll get that accumulation of mercury in their body, and they eat more trout than the trout eats salmon. So you're only supposed to eat that a few times each month, or you might get the mercury build up in your system and have nervous issues from that. Another human interference thing that hurts ecosystems, decreases the biodiversity, would be runoff of fertilizers, water-containing fertilizers. So when we have heavy rains, the fertilizers come off the lawns, dissolving the water, and it goes down the drain pipes and eventually leads to the Gulf of Mexico or the intercoastal water. And what happens is that nitrogen and phosphorus fertilizes the phytoplankton, the algae. And the algae bloom. They grow a great crop of algae. Well, it blocks the light it can cover the whole region of that part of Tampa Bay. And it blocks light off from the seagrasses, hurting the seagrasses, which are like the kelp. They protect baby fish, they're fish nurseries. And the problem is that when the algae blooms, it eventually will die as it ages, and it will sink to the bottom, and then it will be broken down by bacteria, and the bacteria use a lot of oxygen in order to do that. So yeah, algae produces oxygen, gives it to the air, into the water, but when it dies, because there's so much of it, it sits on the bottom, it decomposes, and that takes the oxygen out of the water, and the fish basically fish die because they don't have enough oxygen dissolved in the water to breathe. We have so the golf courses, the lawns, all that fertilizer, agricultural fields like strawberry fields and orange groves, especially cattle, the poop that runs off from the cattle pens and that enters the waterway, and that acts just like the synthetic fertilizers, causing algae blooms because of nitrogen and phosphorus in the poop and the fertilizers. Now in Florida we got a double whammy because the algae that likes to grow in Florida, in our Tampa Bay, is the red tide organism. Okay, red tide organism is an algae that also produces a nerve toxin that paralyzes the fish's gills. So not only is it depleting the oxygen from the water, it's paralyzing the apparatus that fish use to breathe. So there's massive fish kills when we have our red tide blooms. Also, it produces a nasty. If we swallowed that stuff, we would get medical issues for sure. Just breathing the dead fish, and the gas that the red tide gives off can make you sick. It can cause respiratory infections as well. So try to show you in Florida what kind of things we do wrong.